Hi, I'm Nate. I'm a gringo from Southern California, and when I speak Spanish, I sound like a Mexican. Pero ¿cómo lo hice para sonar como un mexicano más? Well, that's exactly what you're going to find out in today's video, and I'm also going to show you how you can have not only a Mexican accent, but any accent that you'd like to have in the Spanish language. So nowadays, when I speak Spanish, a lot of times people confuse me to be from Mexico, and while I personally don't think my Spanish is that amazing, it is one of the most humbling things to have someone say to you, wow, oh, you sound like you're Mexican. Recently, I was flying from Mexico City, Ciudad de Mexico, to Guadalajara, and I was helping an older lady with her bags, and she ends up saying to me, oh, vas a Guadalajara para visitar a tu familia, ¿sí? Y le dije, no, voy a Los Ángeles después de Guadalajara, porque ahí está mi familia. Y me dice, no, pero tienes familia en Guadalajara, ¿no? De ahí es tu familia. Y le dije que no, que soy un gringo y aprendí el español en la prepa. Y se sorprendió mucho, como que, wow, yo pensé que tú eres un mexicano. And the only reason that is because of my accent. I have seen so many amazing people online who speak Spanish beautifully, really, really well. You don't need to have a perfect accent or anything in Spanish, but it is pretty awesome if you can kind of get down a cool accent, whether that's from Mexico, Costa Rica, Colombia, wherever. So how did I do this? How did I get this Mexican accent? Well, first of all, I want you to understand that I never intended to learn a more Mexican Spanish. It just kind of happened. Now, the biggest reason is due to my environment, which we'll get into in a little bit. But I also want you to understand that I've been learning Spanish for 9 years. So my accent compared to my first year of Spanish versus to where it is now is drastically different. In order to improve your pronunciation, people always ask me, Nate, how do I get a more native pronunciation? How do I not sound like such a gringo? A lot of it, honestly, is just a time thing. The more time goes on, the more consistent you are in your study, in your practice, in your speaking, the better your accent is going to become. First things first, in order to have a Mexican Spanish accent, you need to get your fundamentals down. Now, when I say your fundamentals, I mean knowing how to properly pronounce your vowels in Spanish. Now, in Spanish, they are A, E, I, O, U. Please just make sure that you get your vowels down because that is really going to make you sound much more native when speaking Spanish. Is this going to make you sound like a native Mexican Spanish speaker? No, but combined with the other things I'm going to tell you, it will. Okay, so first things first, you gotta get your fundamentals down, get those vowels down. The next thing to have a more native Mexican accent is to know how to roll your R's. Now, a lot of people struggle with this. We're not gonna get into the details of this. However, there are some things that you need to understand about the R, the double R. First thing is that when a word starts with an R, even if it's singular, you're going to roll it. For example, the word real, you are gonna roll the R, even though it's a singular R. Same thing when we have a word, a singular R, in the middle of a word. Es parte de mi vida. Hear that kind of, it's subtle. It's not as strong maybe, but it's still there. Es parte de mi vida. And also at the end of a word, even if it's a singular R, for example, the verb hablar. Hablar. While it's not that pronounced, okay, it's still there. Voy a hablar contigo luego. That is going to make you sound much more native when speaking Spanish. The next thing is your environment. Now, for me, I was lucky in this sense in that I grew up in Southern California and the majority of the spoken Spanish here is Mexican Spanish. So I was constantly hearing this as I grew up, whether I realized that or not. You might not live in an environment where that's possible. So how do you recreate this? Is by listening to music in Spanish. You hear me say it all the time. When I started listening to music in Spanish, specifically Mexican music in Spanish, every single day, to this day, this has been going on for years. Seriously, my accent was like, boom, totally started to sound much more Mexican just because I was subconsciously kind of picking up all the sounds and nuances of a more Mexican Spanish. Hey, if you want to speak Spanish just like me, go to SpanishWithNate.com. But the next big thing is speaking with Mexican Spanish speakers. Of course, the more and more that you're speaking with Mexican Spanish speakers, you're going to pick up not only on their accents and pronunciations, but also the words that they're using so that you sound more native when speaking Spanish. ¿Qué onda, güey? No manches, güey. All of these like little phrases that you're going to pick up and learn are going to make your accent and your Spanish sound much more Mexican. Now, let's say you're interested in learning not just a Mexican Spanish accent or a more Mexican Spanish. Let's say you're interested in Spanish from Argentina or Colombia or Spain or wherever. The biggest number one piece of advice I have for you is to consume a lot of media in that kind of Spanish. For example, if you want to learn Spanish from Spain, make sure that you're consuming a lot of media from that country. For example, watching movies in Spanish, watching TV shows, listening to podcasts with Spanish speakers from Spain, listening to musicians from Spain. All of this intention directed towards that specific Spanish is going to make you have an accent that's more similar to the one you hear in Spain, for example. And of course, within Spain, you have different accents and whatnot. In fact, when I was living and studying in Spain for 3 months, I was in the south of the country in Sevilla. And when I came home, wow, I kind of sounded like a Spaniard. I was saying things like tío, and I was saying ¿cómo estás? Así como. This kind of more Spaniard style of speaking, okay? And that was because of my environment. If you want to recreate that, you want to have this more immersive environment, listen to a lot of music, watch a lot of TV shows, read books, listen to native speakers, speak with native speakers from that country that you're interested in learning, that Spanish accent. Now, the final thing in order to have a more Mexican Spanish accent is to try and imitate the way a Mexican speaker sounds. Now, I've noticed that a lot of times people feel weird or nervous about doing this. They feel like, well, I don't want to be offensive or I don't want to force it. You need to imitate how these speakers sound, because if you want to sound like a native Mexican speaker, then you have to imitate the way that they speak. So instead of saying like, a mí me gustan los tacos or whatever, right? You really want to listen, dive deep into how a Spanish speaker would say that from Mexico. A mí me gustan los tacos. It's a time thing and it's kind of this immersion thing, okay? It's not like all of a sudden you're going to have this perfect Mexican Spanish after watching this video. But as long as you kind of put these principles into play over time, I guarantee you your accent is going to sound much more native and much more Mexican. So let's review everything that we've talked about. Number one is to get your fundamentals down. Make sure that you're properly pronouncing the vowels. A, E, I, O, U. That is the most important thing. Forget choosing a specific Spanish accent. Make sure that you know how to properly pronounce your vowels first, because if you're not pronouncing them correctly, you're not going to sound like a native speaker. I always hear Spanish learners say Z's in Spanish as we would in English. So instead of saying zapato, they would say zapato. Remember, in Spanish, the Z makes an S sound, not a Z sound. So getting your pronunciation down, getting those basic fundamentals down, pronouncing your vowels correctly, and of course the consonants as well. But the vowels are the most important. Next is knowing how to roll your R's. If you can't roll your R's, don't worry, there are plenty of videos out there online teaching you how to roll your R's. I have a video on this in my Spanish Speaker Academy. Try to get your R's down, okay? Understand when we roll our R's. Like I said, listen to a lot of Mexican Spanish speakers so you know how and when they roll their R's. Next is to have an immersive environment. You need to be immersed. You need to be listening to a lot of audio. You need to be listening to a lot of Mexican songs, singers, speakers, everything from Mexico that you like and are interested in. Listen to it, because by constantly immersing yourself in that, you are going to develop this accent just without even having to really try. It just kind of happens. Don't be shy. Try to imitate the way speakers sound. Imitation is the way that you're going to improve your accent and start to sound more native when speaking Spanish. Bueno, esos son mis consejos para ti, para que tú hables más como mexicano o como cualquier persona de Argentina, Costa Rica, Colombia, donde sea. Bueno, muchas gracias por ver este video. Si te haya gustado, por favor, dale un like y también suscríbete ya para que veas más videos chidos así como este. Y si quieres aprender español conmigo, puedes ir a mi sitio web, SpanishWithNate.com, donde yo te enseño cómo hablar un español hermoso. Bueno, cuídate mucho. Adiós.